everybody. My name is Jack Fisher and welcome to my world, and I sincerely hope to shape that world responsibly. In terms of segues into discussing Spider-Man, I hope that's not too blatant. Subtlety on YouTube is next to impossible these days, but if we're going to talk about power and responsibility, it's hard to avoid talking about Spider-Man too, especially if you're a comic book fan like me. As a hero, a character, and a cultural icon, he is the embodiment of this concept. You've all heard his famous quote, "With great power comes great responsibility." Most people know it comes from Spider-Man. Even if you hate comic books and superhero media, you probably know this saying. It's such a common mantra, and it sounds like something a hero would say. It feels like something we can apply to our daily lives. As an ethical principle, it just works. Hell, it's something we'd like to see more of in our leaders these days, but that's another story. But I'd like to pose a relevant question. Just how well does Spider-Man live by this motto of his? That may sound like a foolish notion. I mean, this is the guy who preaches power and responsibility in every medium. Movies, TV shows, cartoons, comics, he echoes this famous saying in some form or another. But preaching great power and great responsibility isn't the same as living by it. To explain, we'll have to add a little scrutiny to our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. As a lifelong fan of comics and superheroes, I've scrutinized Spidey more than most. I grew up on Spider-Man cartoons. I've read countless Spider-Man comics. I've enjoyed the likes of the Clone Saga, One More Day, and the cancellation of Spectacular Spider-Man. Still not over that, by the way. I've observed the many upheavals and transformations of this character over the years. In doing so, I've noticed a frequent issue, one that becomes somewhat of a paradox at times. It has less to do with how responsible Peter Parker is and more to do with why he does what he does. For the most part, his approach to heroism is commendable. He carries himself with the same idealism as other Marvel heroes like Captain America, Iron Man, Daredevil, or the Fantastic Four. Then, when the impact of guilt enters the equation, things get a little tricky and not in a heroic sort of way. Spider-Man discusses guilt more than most heroes, and that's understandable. He feels guilty that he couldn't save his Uncle Ben. As a catalyst for becoming a hero, that works. That's understandable. We can empathize with that. Where things get tricky is how he talks about guilt outside the context of his Uncle Ben. Specifically, he talks about the guilt he feels when he doesn't do enough, or the guilt he feels when he's not responding to a police siren, or the guilt he'd feel if he failed at saving the day, or just the general guilt he'd feel if he stopped being Spider-Man all of a sudden. Now, take a step back and think about what he's implying there. He's focusing on his guilt, how he'd feel. In that context, it's not about doing the right thing or the heroic thing, at least not directly. It's about avoiding guilt. Being responsible is just a byproduct of that. In that sense, is Spider-Man actually living by his own code? To be clear, I'm not saying that Spider-Man's core motivations are wrong. I'm also not understating his heroic deeds and his dedication to saving his loved ones. So please, my fellow Spider-Man fans, don't take this as an indictment of sorts. This is just me exploring some of the inconsistencies in Spidey's heroism. Every hero has inconsistencies. Some are more prominent than others, and I think Spider-Man is his own special case. And I think it's a legitimate concern, looking at the effects of guilt on his motivations. I mean, how much of his heroism is motivated by being responsible, and how much is motivated by avoiding more guilt? One is about doing the greater good, which all heroes try to do in some form or another, but the other is just all about him. In that context, being a responsible hero means being selfish just to the extent of avoiding guilt. That's what makes it a paradox. His heroic deeds have both selfish and selfless elements. It's not always overt, but there are some examples in the comics where Peter's guilt seems to motivate him more than his responsibilities. A good example occurs in the pages of Spectacular Spider-Man #2 by Paul Jenkins and Talent Caldwell. In this issue, Spider-Man encounters an old villain from the Gary Conway era named Mindworm. He was a somewhat forgettable villain. The long and short of it is simple. He did bad things with his superhuman abilities, Spider-Man defeated him, end of story for the most part. But in this issue, Spidey crosses paths with him again years later, and in his current state, Mindworm is less a menacing villain and more just a sad old man living on the streets, begging for food. He's your typical homeless guy in New York, and when Peter learns about it, he tries to help him, he tries to understand him, but he fails, and he feels even more guilty as a result. Now, think back to his motivations. He seeks to help this guy. In his monologues, he frames it as trying to do more, trying to treat the disease rather than the symptoms. But it also comes off as somewhat inheroic in the sense that he treats it as an act of responsibility, but it's the guilt that's motivating him. As a result, his actions feel less like a heroic deed and more like a concerted effort to avoid more guilt. His actions on their own have some heroic effects, but how heroic can anyone really be if guilt is a motivating factor? Guilt, by its nature, often motivates someone to do whatever it takes to feel less guilty. In a sense, it feels like Spider-Man has to do this, not because he wants to. It's not doing the right thing because it's the right thing, it's doing the right thing out of obligation. And is that very heroic? I won't say it's completely selfish, but it does somewhat blur the lines when it comes to heroism. Now, I still love Spider-Man. He's a great hero and a great character. But his approach to heroism is a bit inconsistent at times. Apply just a little bit of scrutiny and you find issues with his entire mentality. It makes his self-sacrificing seem self-serving. It makes his altruism seem all about him, even if it is indirect. It's a strange paradox, but one that frames superheroes in a unique context. In that sense, I think Spider-Man has more to offer than most heroes like him. It's not just about power and responsibility, it's about why someone is motivated to do the right thing, especially when it comes to being a superhero. But what do you think of all this? Is Spider-Man genuine in his efforts to use his powers responsibly? And if so, how genuine? Does his guilt complex undermine his heroism? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please like and subscribe.